Okay, so as folks come in, I just want to say good afternoon to everybody and welcome to the museum. As we were just discussing our first lecture in our series that's called Expanded Perspectives of History. It's a spring lecture series going all the way through the end of May and supported by the Maine Humanities Council. So they very kindly give us funding to be able to, not very well, but support all of these speakers for their time and their knowledge and for taking the afternoon to share with us. So again, as we welcome folks coming in, I just want to invite everybody to find the chat and I think the Q&A options that are at the bottom of this video. So if you have a question that comes up when Matthew's talking, feel free to type them in either one of those. And then we'll have a bit of time at the end and I can read aloud some of those questions and get them answered. Before we get started, as I mentioned, this is part of a series. So reminder that our next lecture is March 31st at 2 p.m., another Thursday, with Pam Eagleson, who's a certified genealogist. She's going to be talking about how, when we learn about individual struggles of our own ancestors, how we learn about the larger story of history. Now on to our guest today. Matthew, is it Bahar? Sorry, I never asked you.
You got it. Yeah, not many people get it right off the bat, but you did. Yeah.
Nice. So Professor Bahar is professor of history at Oberlin College, focusing on the history of colonial North America. His research interests lie in the Atlantic shoreline at the intersection of Indigenous, imperial, and maritime history. His first book, Storm of the Sea, which I have buried over here on my desk, is a maritime history of Wabanaki, French, and English relations in the northern New England and Canadian Maritimes during the 17th and 18th centuries. A second book project he's working on now, I bet, explores cultural encounters and the catastrophe of a shipwreck in early America. He's been supported by various fellowships at the Huntington Library, American Antiquarian Society, Massachusetts Historical Society, and the American Philosophical Society. Today, he's going to be sharing a little bit more from his work on Storm of the Sea, so I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cynthia, for the introduction, and hello, everyone from Oberlin, Ohio. I've got to say that this is my first visit to Kennebunk, virtual or otherwise, so it's very exciting to be able to share this material with this audience in particular, who has a connection to the setting of Maine where this book really takes place. So I think you'll recognize some of the place names and maybe even some of the events that I'll talk about today. So this is exciting. Thank you for extending the invitation to Cynthia to join the spring lecture series. It's a privilege to be here with you. So I'd like to share a bit of the material in the book Storm of the Sea with you, but I'm going to frame it today a little bit differently than I framed the material in the book itself. I'd like to think about what Native Americans in Maine, the Wabanaki tribe, is doing in the colonial period as really part of a larger process of cross-cultural appropriation, that is borrowing or taking from another culture in order to use it yourself and reinforce your own interests in that use. So I'd like to kind of frame it that way today in my talk, and I'd be curious to hear what you think of this. In many of our stories of Native Americans and Europeans or Americans in the past, we often use the term resistance to describe what Indians are doing in their engagement with colonialism and colonists themselves. And I think we've used this framework of resistance so much that we've unwittingly constructed an image of historical Indians as purely oppositional figures. Right? These are people who are always reacting to and resisting the Euro-American presence. Like the myths of the vanishing Indian and the noble savage and the ecological Indian, the trope of what I would call the oppositional Indian is in need of revisiting or some interrogation. And so I'd like to begin my talk today by locating an important moment in the development of what I'd call the oppositional Indian figure in 3 acts of colonial rebellion on the eve of the American Revolution. In the burning of the British customs schooner HMS Gaspee near Warwick, Rhode Island, in June of 1772, in the assault of Royal Customs officials in Newport Harbor, Rhode Island, later that same month, and in the more infamous destruction of East India Company tea in Boston Harbor on December 16, 1773, spirited crowds of New England men defied British authority by storming ships and overpowering crews, all while self-representing as American Indians. The significance of these episodes, of course, is usually understood in the context of American independence in 1776, or the road to independence. But rather than situating this maritime crowd action at the beginning of a revolutionary movement as founding moments in a national narrative, I'd like us to consider them as the aftermath of an older contest for sovereignty and dominion in the northeastern borderlands. For I think they're performances of an earlier troubled chapter in New England's past, and they obscure as much as they reveal about Native Americans. So the earliest recorded instance of Indian disguised colonists overtaking ships occurred near the head of Narragansett Bay on the evening of June 9th, 1772. Mustered from the streets of Providence by the beating of a drum, a fervid crowd under the direction of merchants Abraham Whipple and John Brown embarked in longboats for Namquit Point, now known as Gaspee Point, where His Majesty's revenue cutter, the Gaspee, lay stranded on a sandbar. The naval vessel had foundered in the shoals earlier that day while chasing the Hannah, a colonial packet suspected of smuggling. Since its deployment to American waters by the British Admiralty in 1764, the Gaspee engendered increasing bitterness from Rhode Island merchants and seamen for targeting their province with heavy-handed enforcement. Now, seizing an opportunity to escalate their challenge of royal customs law, Whipple and Brown's forces boarded the beached Gaspee, ransacked several documents, and burned her to the waterline. In the otherwise bloodless raid, the vessel's commander, Lieutenant William Doddingston, attempted to fight back the crowd and received minor wounds from which he quickly recovered after his adversaries transferred him to a nearby doctor. A ballad soon appeared in print around Providence describing the Vandals as, quote, Narragansett Indian men, being 64 in number, end quote. Their native garb successfully concealed the perpetrators, since neither a 500-pound reward posted by the colonial government nor Parliament's formal investigation into the matter could generate any witness testimony. Despite the Crown's determination to prosecute what they called the act of piracy and execute the guilty parties in London, no one was ever apprehended in the incident. Here's an image, an engraving, an undated engraving that appeared in print much later, much after the incident itself, over a century later. But I think this captures, as you can see in the foreground of the image here, captures really the memory of these raiders as dressed as Native Americans. And you can see kind of Indianness saturating this attack on this vulnerable British customs schooner here. So even 100 years later, people are still kind of remembering this, or choosing to remember it as orchestrated by Native Americans, colonists dressed as Native Americans. The incinerated Gaspee had barely stopped smoldering when unidentified smugglers from Newport engaged in a similar obstruction of justice later that month. On the evening of June 26th, 2 customs agents were inspecting an inward bound sloop loaded with 50 hogsheads of undeclared sugar from the West Indies, when a throng of feathered colonists clamored aboard. The quote unquote savages, as local newspapers reported, restrained the officials and confined them to an empty vessel. The new porters then went to work collecting their shipment. The pair of prisoners eventually received a humiliating whipping and were sent on their way. In broad daylight the following morning, the smugglers continued to flout the law by parading their reclaimed ship around the harbor, but were soon, quote, overtaken by the custom houseboat and brought back again, end quote. A year and a half after Rhode Island's Summer of Sedition, other subversive elements in neighboring Massachusetts were setting sights on 3 merchant vessels loaded with a, quote, detestable and obnoxious commodity, end quote. Their broader target, of course, was the recently passed Tea Act. By lowering the tax on tea traded by the struggling East India Company, Parliament hoped the law would undercut Dutch smugglers in the colonies and persuade American consumers to pay the commodity's controversial duty, thereby securing tacit colonial consent to Parliament's authority. Opposition to the East India Company scheme was particularly fierce in Massachusetts, whose royal government strongly supported the policy and withstood local pressure to nullify it. The resulting showdown culminated at Griffin's Wharf on December 16, 1773, when some 100 men organized by Boston's clandestine agitators, the Sons of Liberty, seized control of the recently arrived Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, and destroyed from their cargo some 46 tons of company tea. Eyewitnesses to the vandalism in Boston Harbor described the boarding parties as, quote, dressed like Indians, Aboriginal natives, and savages, end quote. Others specified that the vandals were Mohawks, likely a derivative of the Mohawks, an infamous band of masked carousers terrorizing the streets of London in prior decades. Boston merchant John Andrews identified the intruders as, quote, Indians from Narragansett, end quote. The earlier clashes in Rhode Island evidently fresh in his mind yet. Among the crowd beneath the disguises were mariners, sailors, and shipwrights, the sort of laborers who knew their way around ocean-going vessels. 17 of them belonged to the Lebanon Liberty Club in Lebanon, Maine, and had traveled to Boston for the express purpose, they said, of storming the sloops. This image here is, to my knowledge, the earliest pictorial representation of the so-called Boston Tea Party. It earned that name much later, after the fact, but you can see here even in this early representation of the incident, some of the crew is disguised as Native Americans ransacking the cargo of tea there aboard ship. Maybe a more iconic image is the Courier from Nathaniel Courier, the lithograph from much later, 1846, of this incident, where all of the crew, from this angle at least, is disguised as Native Americans. This image is probably more accurate of the composition of the raiders themselves. It seems like half of them were really disguised as Indians, and the other half were just in colonial attire there. So this image accentuates the Indianness of the storming parties there, and the lingering memory in Americans of the Boston Tea Party as it became known as something really organized and executed by people representing as American Indians. This scene of Massachusetts men in headdresses swarming ships in Boston Harbor has long been a constitutive force in the national narrative of the United States. But as a patriotic ploy, the stunt was by 1773 highly unoriginal. Like the earlier crowd action in Narragansett Bay, the trespassers on the tea ships displayed precision and principle in their act of defiance. Each went out of his way to avoid collateral injury to property and persons. Those boarding the Beaver requested from its captain, Hezekiah Coffin, the keys to the hold, the ship's hold, and some candles for lighting, quote, so that as little damage as possible might be done to the vessel, end quote. In return, Coffin received a promise that, quote, not one article of his goods should be hurt, end quote. Measured force was exercised not only in the destruction of the tea, but also in its subsequent surveillance. A guard was stationed to prevent embezzlement of the wreckage, one bystander reported to the Boston Gazette. Quote, and not a single ounce of tea was suffered to be purloined or carried off, end quote. When onlookers in rowboats approached the floating mats of tea leaves, centuries dispatched men to stir and sink the debris or stamp it into the mudflats. Other patriots made an example out of a Charlestown resident caught lining his pockets by stripping him, covering him with mud, and beating him. Limited in scope, principled in motivation, and coordinated in execution, the rebellions in Rhode Island and Massachusetts constituted an emergent pattern of symbolic protest. The white Indians defying British rule postured as virtuous Republicans par excellence. These were not impulsive opportunists or grasping individualists unleashing violence for gain or advancement. They were rather civic-minded leaders of an opposition movement. The amphibious insurgencies of 1772 and 1773 were but three early instances of what would become a time-honored American tradition of white people masquerading as natives. Several scholars in the social sciences and humanities have examined the practice of, quote, playing Indian, usually by employing a cultural critical approach to the players themselves, endeavoring to pull the mask away and examine what lies beneath. Studies like this have yielded a lot of rich insights into the process of identity formation in various segments of Euro-American society. Many of these scholars and writers have shown that Americans who reckoned with confounding political and economic change co-opted Indianness to experience and perform an Aboriginal closeness to the land, or to express an instinctive love of freedom, or to defend noble traditions. Some other scholars distill meaning from playing Indian, dressing as Indians, about power and social hierarchy by situating white Indians within a larger trans-historical phenomenon of inversion rituals, social inversion rituals, things like mumming and wassailing and skimmington rides. These approaches have proven to be very generative, have led to greater scholarship and greater knowledge about this really curious sequence of episodes in American history. But I think they also foster an assumption that the significance of playing Indian lies only in what it reveals about the Euro-American appropriators in their present context. Scholars, in other words, have limited their inquiry to settlers' anxieties, stereotypes, and power plays, and as a result have overlooked the Indian-white relations that informed colonists' conceptions of the natives whose culture they were co-opting. They've ignored, in other words, some of the real history behind or that predated many of these instances of playing Indian. Indian disguises were not inventions of an ahistorical imagination. They were based on actual people, I think, who shaped the historical experience of the group doing the playing. And as the folklorist Roger Abrahams notes, playing the role of the other can also mean becoming the enemy. The performances of Indianness at Narragansett Bay and Boston Harbor reveal as much about the memory of colonists as they do their unstable identities in a time of imperial crisis. Both memory and identity were deeply fraught in the early 1770s. For by then, New Englanders had endured a long and painful century and a half of predation, maritime predation, organized by real Indians who seized British ships with impunity as their crews looked on in helpless disbelief. Wabanaki warriors from the Saco River in southwestern Maine, northeast to Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, had been commandeering colonial and metropolitan vessels in the greater Gulf of Maine and along the fishing banks of the Northwest Atlantic since their earliest encounters with European fishermen in the 1500s. The sailing technology assimilated from these operations revolutionized native mobility and facilitated the alignment of Wabanaki's political and economic interests into a formal confederacy with extractive ambitions that rivaled those of European empires in the region, France and England. By the mid-17th century, Indian seaborne raids against English fishing crews, settlers, merchants, and traders, these colonists that were demonstrating a particularly aggressive encroachment on native lands in the Dawn Land, as they called Maine and Nova Scotia. These raids on these English colonists took on a punitive and extractive quality. They served at once to enforce and enrich an indigenous sovereignty, a territorial sovereignty. To the New England colonists regularly victimized in these campaigns, and to the government officials in Boston, Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia, and London, to whom they pled for help, Wabanaki maritime power became a grueling and inescapable fact of life by the 1720s. I'm not sure I need this map here for this particular audience attached to Kennebunk or with connections to Maine, but here's a really good map of the ancestral homelands of the Wabanaki Indians, what they called the Dawn Land. And you can see marked on the map there in finer print some of the constituent tribes, the Penobscot and the Micmac, for example. Exactly when the people of the Dawn, the Wabanaki, first encountered sailing vessels is unclear. The archaeological record offers no firm evidence of the watercraft in the Northeast prior to European arrival. We know from some sources, historical and material, though, that birch bark canoes were fairly commonplace along the waters of Maine. Native oral traditions almost always emphasize Indians' curiosity about sailing vessels at first contact. And this curiosity often preceded their regard of the strangers sailing them on board. This pictograph that I began the talk with on the opening slide of the PowerPoint, this pictograph or a rock, an etching in a rock, comes from a national park in Nova Scotia. It's not dated, but it's been found around a lot of other pictographs from kind of the early colonial period. And we know that Native Americans created pictographs or petroglyphs, carvings into rock rather than paintings on rock. They created petroglyphs to memorialize events or objects that held a particular significance, spiritual or otherwise, for them. So I think it's really telling that this pictograph of petroglyph of a sailing vessel, a European sailing vessel, has been preserved and memorialized and put down in a distinctly indigenous way here. Historical evidence, written documents, indicate that in their seasonal meetings with foreign fishing crews over the 16th century, the Micmac were developing a firsthand experience with small coastal sailboats known as shallops. When the French settler Nicolas Denis arrived in Acadia in 1632, natives there were casually making use of sloops left behind by departing fishing crews, who had them hidden on the coast or in the ponds in order to make use of them upon their return the following year. This finders keepers arrangement existed for quite some time before the 1630s, since the Indians, Denis noted, all have boats for the sea that supplemented their more fragile birch bark canoes, increasingly relegated for use in riverine travel. The single-masted, modestly rigged coastal boats, shallops, provided native novices with an ideal introduction to the science of sail. This is an image from actually Captain John White, the English explorer's records of a shallop, kind of your run-of-the-mill conventional shallop from the 16th and early 17th century. And you can see it as a pretty basic craft that would have been used to explore the coast and go out on just simply usually daily fishing and exploratory missions here. This was what you might call the introduction for Indians to the art and the science and the mechanics of sailing craft. Indians, as we'll see in a second, though, set their sights on even larger targets than this and succeeded in sailing some bigger, multiple-masted craft. The technical acumen that Micmac sailors honed through this informal exchange economy with European fishermen often caught European explorers off guard. In 1583, a French ship called the Chardon, led by a Rouen merchant, Etienne Bélanger, attempted to trade with some coastal Micmacs in southern Acadia by dispatching a few men in the ship's pinnace. The Indians proceeded to decoy the main crew while others moved in and attacked the traders, killing 2 of the sailors and scattering the rest. Then they seized and made off with the pinnace. This aggressive seamanship also shocked Bartholomew Gosnold's expedition to the southern Maine coast in 1602, when crewmen confronted, quote, 6 Indians in a Basque shallop with mast and sail, who came boldly aboard us with an iron grapple, end quote, and demanded trade. Likewise, when Henry Hudson's party rowed ashore near the mouth of the Penobscot River in 1609 to mend their sails and cut a new foremast, they, quote, spied 2 French shallops full of the country people, end quote, sailing into the harbor after them. Under their sails, Indians aggressively initiated encounters to secure wealth for their communities and display their nautical proficiency to strangers. By the 1630s, Micmacs were diversifying their use of local plant and animal resources to engineer their own versions of the foreign craft. One specimen came up upon the Frenchman Nicolas Denis, who observed that it, quote, went with a sail made from a well-dressed skin of a young moose, end quote. Another domestic model stunned the crew of the English explorer John Josselyn, as they caught sight of, quote, an Indian pinnace sailing by us, end quote, off the New England coast somewhere in 1638. The homeward bound vessel, made of birch bark, sewed together with the roots of spruce and white cedar, synthesized elements of European and indigenous design. Equipped with a deck and trimmed with sails top and top gallant, Josselyn marveled, the hybrid had been built, quote, very sumptuously, end quote, and apparently very durably if it supported such elaborate rigging. By incorporating boat building into their manufacturing activities, Indians managed their reliance on early Europeans for access to an increasingly coveted innovation. By the mid-17th century, chiefs across the Dawnland were deploying sailing craft to counter the aggressive expansion of New England colonists into their ancestral homelands. Colonial sawmills, dams, and fishing stages proliferated along coastal Maine in the wake of this incursion. As King Philip's War raged across southern New England in 1675, the Saco River headman, Maug Hegan, seized the opportunity to launch repeated naval offenses against English ships and settlements around the Gulf of Maine. Captain Maug, as he became known in colonial circles, led 100 Marine warriors to the mouth of the Kennebec River, where they attacked and seized a fishing shallop before proceeding to nearby Damaris Cove, where they overpowered the English crew of a sloop and sailed away with it. A month later, Maug's growing force succeeded in laying siege to the English garrison at Black Point, the strongest fortification on the northeastern frontier. Later that day, his forces commandeered a 30-ton ketch docked at Richmond's Island to load the supplies of a fleeing settler named Walter Gendall. Maug boasted to one of his colonial captives that he, quote, laughs at the English and hath found the way to burn Boston, end quote. As it had since the earliest period of European exploration, native nautical prowess rivaled and at times even surpassed the skills of experienced Euro-American seafarers. During Queen Anne's War in 1707, one of the longer colonial wars between France and England in the Northeast and in other places around the Atlantic world, 150 Indians in 50 canoes beset Winter Harbor, Maine, where 2 shallops were riding at anchor. After this massive fleet unleashed a barrage of gunfire and drove the British into one of the ships, they stormed the abandoned vessel and, according to the stunned British onlookers, quote, immediately hoisted the sails before our men could hoist theirs halfway a trip, end quote. Other Indians seized a large schooner with 2 swivel guns from the Isle of Shoals during Father Raleigh's War, or Governor Dummer's War in the 1720s. After that happened, a modest sloop and shallop of Maine and Ipswich men sailed in pursuit. Not long after their departure, though, the dejected volunteers, quote, returned with their rigging much damaged by the swivel guns and able to give no other account of the enemy than that they had gone into Penobscot, end quote. Shocked residents of York, Maine, witnessed a sloop and a ketch chase down and capture the crew of a local fishing captain after they fired heavy artillery at him during King William's War in 1692, remarking that they, quote, sail incomparably well, end quote. Ships were not the only part of Europe's maritime culture co-opted and assimilated by Wabanaki. Native leaders knew that it was also the clothes that made the man. For Indians, what people wore and how they wore it signaled their cultural connections and socio-political status. Chiefs who donned European nautical attire showcased their privileged possession of rare and exotic goods, and in turn demonstrated that their influence ashore ought to be respected in their seafaring communities afloat. When a shallop with 6 people approached Gosnold's vessel off the southern Maine coast, Bartholomew Gosnold's vessel off the southern Maine coast in 1602, they were, quote, supposed at first to be Christians, distressed, end quote. But as the mysterious sailors drew closer and boarded the English ship, Gosnold realized that they were Indians, led by a commander, quote, appareled with a waistcoat and breeches of black serge made after our sea fashion, along with hose and shoes on his feet, end quote. Another of the native crew, likely some other military leader, wore, quote, a pair of breeches of blue cloth, end quote. Indian leaders intended their striking appearance to not only communicate power and prestige to other Indians, but also to blur and disguise as they closed in on an unsuspecting ship. Playing European was a careful ruse, an aesthetic ambiguity that masked and assumed identities. Real cases of mistaken identities at sea began to surface as colonists grew accustomed to seeing native sailors in European dress and in European vessels. When Samuel de Champlain and the French colonists at Port Royal, Acadia, caught sight of a shallop coming from Cape Sable one July day in 1605, they initially, quote, thought it contained Indians who were leaving Cape Breton or the island of Canso, end quote. Not until the boat had almost reached them did the settlers finally recognize in it some Frenchmen and the secretary of an Acadian official. A small band of English traders and fishermen camped along the shore of Cape Breton Island in 1629 also misjudged some visitors. As they strained their eyes on 6 shallops approaching the beach, the English speculated that they were manned by Indians. Yet a sliver of doubt remained, so the colonists discharged some muskets at the shallops to discover who they were. The phantom ships continued their approach until the English believed they finally had an answer, quote, finding by their apparel that they were not savages, end quote. But these assumptions quickly gave way to reality when several Indians disembarked with several French crew members and took everyone captive. To colonists desperate to stop the bleeding of their ships and cargoes into Wabanaki hands, Britain's highly publicized campaign against Atlantic piracy in the 1720s and 1730s offered a solution. Authorities in Boston and Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia, co-opted an expedient rhetoric of piracy to connect Wabanaki sea power to the banditry gaining headlines in the West Indies and in other parts of the empire. Europeans used the term piracy to describe a very specific sort of maritime theft. Pirates were seafaring robbers unaffiliated with a state and indiscriminate in their choice of targets. Seaborne plundering was piracy when a victimized nation, determined to police its sovereign territory, said so. When British victims applied the descriptor pirate to Wabanaki raiders, they judged them to be a pre-political and pre-modern people, possessing a primitive culture that lacked the organizing principles of European empires and the civilized societies that built them. Indians were people without law and social structure, and thus devoid of political community. They were closer to a state of nature than to the states comprising the international community. In criminalizing and delegitimizing native sea power, and in accentuating the statelessness of native society, the rhetorical work of piracy prevented contemporaries from recognizing Indians as political actors. The looming statelessness of Indian piracy appeared to colonial authorities so threatening to all that was good in the civilized world that Britain hoped it might unite even the bitterest of imperial rivals in the Northeast. Nova Scotia leaders cultivated French assistance in the fight against Wabanaki pirates, looking past the two empires' historical enmities to their common political status. After Indian warriors in 1727, quote, committed diverse barbarous acts of hostility upon an English vessel at Newfoundland and some other fishermen that were at anchor at Cape Sables, end quote, an enraged Lieutenant Governor Lawrence Armstrong appealed to the French governor at nearby Louisbourg for help, condemning what he called, quote, the robbery and seizure of the English sloop, end quote, in such a piratical manner, contrary to the law of all nations, end quote. Armstrong invoked France and Britain's shared status in a community of nations. If the, quote, authors of this robbery are justly to be deemed pirates, end quote, the French were duty-bound to assist in their apprehension. Rendering Wabanaki pirates allowed colonial leaders to rationalize their persistent failure to stop Indians from ravaging British subjects at sea. Just as the indigenous American style of land-based combat confounded European military tacticians, so too did piracy elude European officials struggling to police their maritime jurisdictions. When settlers and fishermen preyed upon by Indian raids cried out for help again and again, authorities wanted them to know that they were all up against a very difficult sort of problem. Massachusetts militia officers recruited volunteers from Piscataqua in July 1724, not to engage a naval threat, but to go hunting, quote, after Indian pirates, end quote. Another militia leader, Samuel Penhallow, explained away the interminable losses of British fishing merchants by reporting that the Indians, quote, had resolved to turn pirates, end quote. Leaders adopted this new terminology to articulate their response to a peculiar Indian problem that had plagued their colonies and their Atlantic economy since the 1670s. Pirates were technically criminals in English law, and suspected criminals had to be brought to trial before a court. The Court of Admiralty in London and the Vice Courts of Admiralty in the colonies handled all cases of piracy in the empire. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, English officials succeeded in bringing only 3 Wabanaki to justice. The merchant crew who apprehended them nearly paid with their lives. The pirate trio were among a small warrior party who in October 1726 seized a Captain Doughty's vessel as he lay at anchor in a Nova Scotia harbor. Behind a French settler who boarded the ship and, quote, snapped a pistol, end quote, at one of the crewmen, the Indians fell upon them with their cutlasses and impressed Doughty and his men into service. As the commandeered vessel bore down on another ship, one of Doughty's crewmen who had escaped below deck during the hijacking emerged with guns. The other captives joined him, at which point, quote, 3 of the Indians jumped out of the cabin window, they being then a mile or 2 from the shore, end quote. The others surrendered. 3 Wabanaki prisoners, along with, quote, a squaw and 2 papooses, end quote, were taken to Boston and brought before a Vice Court of Admiralty on October 4th. The Indian pirates, newspapers decreed to Bostoners, were found guilty and received sentence of death. Days later, they swung from the public gallows. Britain's defeat of the French in the 7 Years' War eliminated Wabanaki's strategic geopolitical position between 2 European empires. In other parts of the book, Storm of the Sea, I show how Wabanakis really used their French allies at Louisbourg and in other parts of Canada as a marketplace for their commandeered English ships. They would sell, the French would ransom these ships from Indians and then sell them back to the English in New England and in other parts of the English colonies, hoping to avoid an international incident because of kind of the Wabanaki economy or a black market that had emerged. The defeat of the French, though, in the French and Indian War eliminated this for Indians, and it dealt a fatal blow to indigenous power, both ashore and afloat. New Englanders escaped from their long struggle with the Confederacy, only to confront a new imperial adversary after 1763. In their defiance of a distant sovereign seemingly intent on coercing dependence through consumerism and trade regulation, colonists reconceptualized and reperformed their protracted struggle with Wabanaki sea raiders in politically expedient ways. they turned Indian pirates into patriots. They reimagined Wabanaki history and Wabanaki violence specifically as merely reactionary and defensive resistance to an intrusive power that threatened local liberties and time-honored ways of life. Caricaturing Indians as America's first oppositional figures armored the patriotic movement in Narragansett Bay and Boston Harbor with authenticity and resolve. And it was not long before this distortion assumed a life of its own. The reductive image of the Indian rebel, like the Wabanaki history that I believe contributed to it, would be reconstructed and repurposed in the post-revolution era as well. New Englanders of the early 19th century came to remember Indian resistance as ultimately tragic. The figure of the vanishing Indian, natives as people of the past doomed to extinction, addressed its own historical moment. Already by then, the caricature of the oppositional Indian was proving itself durable and malleable. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Sorry, turn myself back on here. Thank you for that perspective. I will admit that, and hopefully folks listening as well, the lens through which you just presented that kind of the starting with the Boston Tea Party and then connecting it all the way back. I think I had never thought of it that way before, and I appreciate that perspective. Was that, I guess the first question that as folks, and I'll remind folks that if you want to ask a question, you're welcome to type it in the chat or in the Q&A. I have both windows open, so feel free to type your questions. And as you're thinking, I was just wondering, Matt, was there something that got you started thinking about this project? And obviously, I'm sure with the book, it's been a long process, but what was the kind of start of this whole thing?
Yeah, I think like a lot of academics, right? Their first project or their first book kind of begins in graduate school, and that's where mine began. And when I was in graduate school thinking about a dissertation, which is, of course, the culminating project of the degree, I knew I wanted to study Native Americans, and I knew I wanted to study the maritime history of the Northeast. And I felt like writers who wrote about these two subjects often didn't really speak to one another. And I began to detect this kind of lingering assumption that a lot of us have of Indians as terrestrial peoples, right? They're not maritime peoples, and or at least their maritime history, if it existed at all, is some moment, time out of mind, that once Europeans arrived, everything kind of ended on the water for Indians. So it began there, and it began out of an attempt to kind of make these two groups of scholars and writers and make these two types of history speak to one another. Mm-hmm. And as I began to think about which Native Americans I wanted to study to write this project, I came upon the Wabanaki of the Northeast and knew that there's some of the few Native Americans who still exist along the ocean today in the East Seaboard, right? So I knew that there had to be something there. Like, why are they still there? What's their maritime past, and what is it? How has that past informed the present? So that's where it began. And as I got into the archives and at the Maine Historical Society and in Boston and in London, I discovered all this material about the piracy aspect of it and the assimilation of sailing technology. And it was totally fascinating. And every subsequent project is, I think, going to fail in comparison to this, but hopefully not. We'll see.
That's fair. Thank you for answering that. And as you were talking, there were a couple of questions have popped up, so I'll read them out. Karen's wondering, do you think the Boston Tea Party, quote unquote, Indians expected to be really seen as such, or was it or as a symbolic reaction?
Yeah, good question. I think, and I think a lot of contemporaries who looked on at this event saw it as symbolic, and a lot of the historical evidence indicates that these costumes were kind of crude. I mean, they weren't full-fledged disguises. They were some charcoal over their face, some charcoal markings, and some gunny sacks kind of draped over them almost as blankets, and perhaps a feather or two in their hair. So everybody seemed to know like who these guys were. Yeah. So I don't think the raiders or the people looking on really understood it or saw it as a disguise, but rather deeply symbolic, right? About their resistance and about their connection to the land, and their aboriginal closeness to America, and their right to rule themselves and achieve liberty themselves. I think they really saw it, and certainly I see it. I want us to see it as symbolic, right? But an enactment of their past in strange sort of ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hope that works. I hope that answers your question, Karen.
Sam says, this is an important missing piece. Now I'm trying to put into the larger context of the Wabanaki. Have you been in touch with the Wabanaki and gotten their response?
Yeah, I so early in my graduate career, when the project began, I did my graduate work at the University of Oklahoma, which is maybe one of the most landlocked places in the continent. I found it really difficult to maintain any sort of relationship or connection with Wabanaki. But since then, as I've gotten more into the research and the writing of the project, and as the books come out, I've met Micmac chief in Nova Scotia, and I gave him a copy of the book, kind of introduced myself, and he seemed eager and enthusiastic to read about it. But to more directly answer your question, I don't have any kind of formal contact with Wabanaki elders or historians at all. But I'm eager to know if anyone has read it and what their reaction is to it. And I'd be eager to talk more about them with it. So
that's great.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're edging towards the 3 o'clock. So I'll remind anybody, if you have any last questions, just to type them here, which Karen just did. She's wondering why Indigenous folks didn't develop sailing technology prior to Europeans arriving. Did the birch bark canoes get them where they needed to go, so they simply did not feel a need for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know if this was clear at the beginning of my talk, but we don't really know for sure if they did have sails on these canoes or on these vessels. They certainly had the resources to create them, as I demonstrated early on in the talk. Remember the moose skin sail and the birch bark vessel sewed together with the threads of spruce and cedar. Right? They had the resources to do it, but we just don't know if it predated Europeans or if this is something, a skill and a mode of transportation, a technology of transportation that they learned from Europeans. One of the things I want to emphasize to readers in the book is that sailing vessels allowed the Wabanaki to cohere into a formal confederacy, because I believe that it put them together, or it facilitated an interface among far-flung Wabanaki communities that even previously had been bitter enemies, fighting over resources and other things. But sailing craft put these people into contact with one another, as did the pressure of English colonization on the region. And this is something that hadn't been possible before with birch bark canoes. And it seems like birch bark canoes sufficed in reinforcing or facilitating a very localized economy and a localized kind of worldview or regional worldview. Sailing vessels blew all that out of the water, right? It blew all that up and allowed for connective tissues to be built across the Dawnland in ways that hadn't been possible before.
So I just have one last question for you, Matthew, and that is, it's less about the book, but wondering how you did your research. As you noted, you were postgraduate was landlocked
Right.
state, and you're in Ohio now. So what is it like doing the research for something that is based in the Maritimes?
Yeah, it's difficult, sure, but thanks to a lot of generous funding from a lot of archival institutions and museums in the Northeast, like the Massachusetts Historical Society and the Maine Historical Society and others, there's funding that helped me make the leap from the dusty plains to so yeah, without that and without the generosity of my graduate program, they were very supportive of graduate students financially. And
Oh,
it was inconvenient. The geography was inconvenient, but I was able to overcome that with the really generous pocketbooks by a lot of really generous institutions.
fantastic. That's always nice to hear.
Yeah.
So everyone, I now found it in my file. This is Matthew's book, which will shortly be here in the museum store. If anybody's thinking of visiting, you'll be able to pick one up, or obviously you are welcome to pick them up at any book establishment. And I just want to say a big thanks to Matthew for zooming in with us from across the country today, and we really appreciate all the information you just shared. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I should say too, if anyone does have further questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out over email. I think you can find that on our website. The Oberlin College's history department has a website. You'll find me there. Please feel free to reach out, send an email. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Nice. That's very kind, Matthew. Thank you so much. And I want to wish everybody a good day, and we'll see you for the next one on March 31st.
Goodbye.
Bye.